She said it was a mistake. I knew it was a choice. And that changed everything. The day started like any other, ordinary and unremarkable, until I saw her. She appeared almost out of nowhere, stepping lightly into the corner cafe where I had sought refuge from the monotony of my week. The air carried the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee, but beneath it, subtle and unmistakable, was the fragrance I remembered, her perfume, delicate yet commanding, a quiet signature of who she had always been. My chest tightened without warning. She looked different somehow, not in appearance, graceful as ever, but in the way she moved, hesitant, like she was stepping into a moment she hadn't fully prepared to face. Her eyes met mine briefly before darting away, and even from across the room, I could sense the tension that hummed beneath her poised exterior. That tension, oddly familiar, made my pulse quicken. Then she spoke. Her voice, soft but laden with weight, carried across the short distance between us. I made a mistake. The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through every memory we shared. I froze, the cup in my hand suddenly heavy, my fingers tightening around its warmth. Mistake. Such a simple word, yet it bore so much. My mind raced, recalling the laughter, the small comforts, the late-night conversations that had once drawn us together so effortlessly. And now, she framed it as a misstep, as though the depth of what we had been meant nothing. I wanted to respond immediately, to let her know the impact of those words, but something held me back. I inhaled slowly, noting the small, almost imperceptible ways she fidgeted, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, her gaze drifting to the window. She was nervous, fragile even, but there was still that unmistakable grace, that quiet authority in her posture. I moved closer, careful to respect the space between us. My steps were measured, deliberate, because this wasn't just a casual encounter. It was the reopening of a chapter one had thought carefully closed. She noticed, I could tell, as her lips parted slightly, her breath catching in subtle anticipation, or perhaps apprehension. We stood there, suspended in the shared history between us. The world around the cafe blurred. The background hum of conversation faded into insignificance. My heart recognized her before my mind did. I saw the vulnerability beneath her composed exterior, the silent plea for understanding she couldn't voice, and for a moment, I caught myself remembering why I had once cared so deeply. But even amidst the memory, a truth anchored me. Words like mistake could not erase choices. I could feel the tension in the space between us, electric and fragile, and I knew that this conversation would mark the beginning of something that could never simply return to what it was. I exhaled, steadying myself, my eyes locking with hers. She had spoken her confession. And now it was my turn to decide how much of myself I would allow to surface. After the initial shock of her confession, silence settled between us like a fragile bridge, tentative and trembling. The hum of the cafe faded into background noise, and I suggested we take a walk, a neutral space where words could flow without the weight of familiarity pressing on every gesture. She nodded, a subtle relief softening her shoulders, though her hands still fidgeted with the strap of her bag as if holding herself together. As we stepped outside, the cool breeze brushed past us, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked pavement and distant flowers. It mingled with the lingering trace of her perfume, and I felt my chest tighten again. There was a rhythm to our steps, careful and cautious, that mirrored the hesitation in our conversation. Neither of us spoke immediately. Sometimes, silence communicates more than words ever could. Eventually, she broke it. I didn't mean for things to happen the way they did. Her voice was soft, layered with regret, but it lacked the force of accountability I needed to hear. I nodded slowly, letting her words hang in the air, tracing the edges of memory. My mind drifted back to afternoons spent in laughter and quiet intimacy, the small gestures that had once meant the world. Her hand brushing mine when she thought I wasn't looking, the way her eyes crinkled at a joke only I understood. I spoke carefully, deliberately, each word measured. We shared more than moments. We shared pieces of ourselves, pieces you knew mattered. My gaze never wavered, observing the subtle shift in her posture, the way she held herself as though bracing against an invisible current. Her eyes flickered toward mine, searching, almost pleading for understanding, yet there was a fragility beneath it, an almost imperceptible tremor that belied her usual composure. She paused, letting the weight of my words settle. I could see her taking inventory of her own choices, her hand brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, her fingers lingering as if reluctant to let go. The world seemed to shrink to the space we occupied, the rhythm of our footsteps echoing the pulse of unresolved history between us. Every detail anchored me, the warmth of sunlight filtering through the trees, casting gentle patterns across her face, the soft rustle of her coat as she moved, the faint scent of coffee still clinging to the sleeve of her sweater. All of it reminded me of her, and all of it reminded me why the past mattered so deeply. Finally, she spoke again, quieter this time, almost a whisper. I wish I could take it back. I felt the weight of the words, the longing beneath them, but I also felt the unshakable truth that choices aren't erased by regret. My voice stayed calm, steady, carrying both recognition and restraint. Mistakes fade in memory, but choices define us. That's what we have to reckon with. There was a pause, heavy and still, and in that silence, our shoulders brushed, accidental, fleeting, yet charged with unspoken emotion. It was a gentle reminder of the connection that had once been effortless, a memory of closeness that neither time nor distance could fully erase. As we continued walking, our conversation meandered, circling around the past without fully dwelling in pain. The tension remained, but beneath it, a fragile bridge of understanding was forming. We weren't yet healed, nor fully reconciled, but the first steps toward truth, however tentative, had been taken. After we parted that evening, the quiet of my apartment felt heavier than usual. The world outside moved with its usual rhythm, oblivious to the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. I sank into the couch, the fabric rough beneath my fingertips, and closed my eyes, letting memory and emotion converge. Her words, "I made a mistake," replayed over and over, each repetition stirring a different response: hurt, confusion, residual affection, and an almost imperceptible longing. It wasn't just what she said, but the way she said it. Her voice carried a fragile weight, a tremor that betrayed vulnerability beneath her usual composed demeanor. I remembered the moments in the past when she had shared parts of herself only with me, her quiet smiles, the way she leaned just a little closer when she wanted reassurance, the warmth of her hand brushing mine in fleeting contact. These memories were vivid, tactile, and stubbornly persistent. I ran a hand through my hair, thinking back to the coffee shop, to the way sunlight had caught her hair in a soft halo, to the subtle scent that had lingered in the air long after she had left. My mind traced each gesture, each glance, each nuance of her presence, small, almost imperceptible, but weighted with meaning. And I realized how deeply my body remembered her even when my mind tried to stay detached. But with memory came conflict. The rational part of me, the part that had carefully built walls to protect my heart, resisted the pull of nostalgia. Choices mattered. Actions mattered. Mistakes alone did not erase the consequences of what she had done. I felt the tension in my chest tighten, a physical manifestation of the dilemma between past affection and present boundaries. I tried to focus on the silence, on the soft hum of the city beyond my window, but even that offered no escape. My emotions were tangled, shifting between forgiveness and resentment, curiosity and caution. Every recollection of her warmth, the way she had once let her shoulder brush against mine, the soft cadence of her laughter, made the ache sharper. Yet the memory of her choice, the one she called a mistake, anchored me firmly in reality. I reached for my phone, tempted to send a message, to seek clarity or perhaps to bridge the distance, but my fingers hovered above the screen. One wrong word, one misstep, and the fragile thread between us could snap entirely. So I let it remain, suspended, unresolved. Even in solitude, the pull of her presence lingered. It was in the quiet moments, the sigh of evening wind, the faint creak of the floorboard, the way my coffee cup felt unusually cold in my hand. I realized that emotional intimacy is not measured by proximity alone. It lives in memory, in the way someone leaves a lasting imprint on your senses, your body, your very rhythm. By the time night deepened, I had made a quiet decision, I would allow myself to feel, to remember, but not yet to act. For now, my struggle would remain internal, a silent dialogue between heart and mind. The unresolved tension was painful, yes, but it was also alive, a sign that what had existed between us still mattered, and that any resolution, when it came, would have to honor both truth and desire. The evening air was cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant rain. She had suggested meeting at her apartment, a neutral, private space where we could finally speak openly. I arrived a few minutes early, standing on the balcony and letting the city lights blur into soft gold against the darkening sky. My hands were in my pockets, but they trembled slightly, betraying the tension I had carried all day. When she opened the door, I felt the familiar pull of memory, the warmth in her eyes, the subtle grace in her movements. But now, there was a cautious hesitancy beneath her composure, a silent acknowledgement that tonight would not be easy. She closed the door gently behind us, and for a moment, we stood in the quiet, letting the weight of our shared history settle between us. Her voice broke the stillness, soft yet deliberate. "I wanted to tell you the truth, about everything." There was a tremor, a hint of vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. I noticed it immediately, the way her fingers clutched the edge of the counter, how her shoulders subtly curved inward, as if bracing against the magnitude of the conversation to come. I drew a slow breath and kept my tone calm, steady, refusing to let emotion overpower clarity. "I need to hear it from you," I said, keeping my distance, though close enough to feel the subtle warmth radiating from her. Her words were heavy, and I felt the careful weight of each syllable in the quiet space between us. She spoke hesitantly, explaining the choices she had made, the fears that had driven her actions, and the insecurities that had clouded her judgment. Each confession carried a raw honesty that was almost painful to witness. I could see the tension in her jaw, the brief flicker of shame in her gaze, and the way her hand lingered near her chest as if protecting something vulnerable. I listened without interruption, my eyes tracking every nuance, every micro-expression. When she paused, I responded, firm yet measured. "You made a choice. Mistakes are one thing, but choices define who we are. That's what matters now." My words hung in the air, deliberate and unavoidable, a mirror reflecting both her vulnerability and the consequences of her actions. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. In that moment, the space between us was alive with tension and unspoken history. Our shoulders nearly touched as I shifted slightly, and for an instant, the old familiarity pressed against the boundaries we had carefully maintained. She didn't move away, but neither did she close the gap. It was a delicate standoff of emotion, part longing, part caution. We stood there, breathing quietly, aware of each subtle movement, the slight tilt of her head, the brief catch of her breath, the warmth of proximity without contact. It was in these unspoken gestures that the depth of our connection revealed itself, more potent than any words, more honest than any confession. By the time the conversation ended, there was a fragile equilibrium. The truth had been laid bare, boundaries had been reinforced, and yet a thread of connection lingered, delicate and unbroken. Tonight, we had faced honesty, raw, uncomfortable, and necessary, and it had changed the landscape between us forever. The day had stretched long, and yet there was an unusual calm in the quiet space we shared. We had moved past the initial confrontation, past the heavy words of accountability, and now there was room for something more delicate, something unspoken, yet profound. I followed her to a small balcony overlooking the city, the late afternoon sun casting golden slivers across her face, catching the subtle highlights in her hair. She smiled faintly, almost shyly, and for a moment, I was reminded of the woman I had known before regret and choices had intervened. The soft warmth of her presence drew me in, but I resisted the urge to bridge the distance too quickly. Instead, I let the silence speak, allowing the space between us to become a quiet canvas for understanding. We began with small talk, mundane observations about the day, the hum of distant traffic, and the changing color of the sky. Yet even in these ordinary words there was a depth, a careful negotiation of trust, of emotional territory. Her hands rested lightly on the balcony railing, fingers brushing against mine almost accidentally, and I felt the subtle electricity of connection pulse in that fleeting contact. It was the kind of touch that lingered in memory, delicate but charged with emotion. She spoke softly, sharing fears she had kept buried, moments of insecurity that had influenced her choices, and doubts about her own worthiness of understanding or forgiveness. I listened with my whole attention, noticing the way her gaze softened when she looked at me, the tremor in her voice when she admitted vulnerability, the subtle shifts in posture that spoke louder than words. In response, I shared parts of myself as well, the quiet hurt I had carried, the moments of longing and hesitation, the struggle to reconcile past affection with present realities. My voice was steady, but inside, I felt the weight of vulnerability pressing gently against the boundaries I had tried to maintain. She nodded, her eyes never leaving mine, occasionally reaching for a cup of tea or brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, movements that seemed mundane yet intimate in their timing. There was a moment when our hands almost touched again, hovering near each other as if drawn by some silent gravity. Neither of us moved deliberately, but the proximity was undeniable. The quiet intimacy in that suspended space was richer than any confession. It was the acknowledgement that, despite everything, we were still connected, still capable of understanding each other in a way few others could. We didn't rush to fill the silence. We allowed it to exist, heavy with meaning. It was a shared understanding that vulnerability could coexist with boundaries, that intimacy could be expressed in gestures and glances as much as in words. The warmth of the afternoon sun, the faint breeze brushing her cheek, the subtle scent she carried, all of it was etched into my senses, a reminder that connection is not always loud or dramatic, but quiet, patient, and enduring. As the moment lingered, I realized that mutual vulnerability was not a weakness. It was a bridge, fragile but undeniable, between two people navigating the aftermath of choices and mistakes. And in that delicate honesty, we found a tentative peace, a quiet step toward understanding each other, and ourselves, more fully. Night had settled over the city, draping streets and rooftops in a quiet darkness, punctuated only by the soft glow of streetlights and the occasional distant hum of traffic. I found myself walking beside her under a thin drizzle, the rain tapping gently on our shoulders and umbrellas, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the tension between us. The day's calm, the tentative understanding we had shared, now felt fragile, as if any word, any gesture, could tip the balance. She kept her gaze mostly forward, but I could feel her awareness of me in every subtle movement, the way her coat brushed mine when we passed too closely, the slight hitch in her breath when the wind caught her hair, the warmth radiating from her presence despite the chill. I, too, felt that pull, an almost magnetic gravity that made distance feel both necessary and impossible. Finally, we paused under a lamppost, the rain forming a curtain around us. She turned to face me, her eyes reflecting both vulnerability and an unspoken question. "I need you to know, everything I feel, everything I did, it wasn't easy for me to admit," she said, her voice low, almost trembling. The weight of her honesty hung in the air, pressing gently against the tension I had carried for weeks. I looked at her, really looked, at the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, the quiet strength that had always drawn me in. I exhaled slowly, letting my voice carry both firmness and empathy. "I care about you. But choices define us. Words alone don't erase the consequences." My gaze held hers, unwavering, as the rain painted our faces in streaks of silver light. The silence that followed was heavy but alive. Our shoulders brushed slightly as we shifted, and I felt the subtle warmth of her proximity. Neither of us moved to fill the space with unnecessary words. Instead, we let the tension breathe, acknowledge itself. Every micro-expression, every subtle gesture, the tilt of her head, the fleeting lift of her brow, the way her fingers lingered near mine, spoke volumes. She finally took a small step closer, hesitant but deliberate, as if testing the boundaries we had carefully maintained. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the rain, a sensory imprint that anchored me in the present, even as memories of past laughter and shared quiet moments surged around me. The closeness was almost unbearable, charged with all the unspoken words, desires, and regrets we had navigated so far. Her voice broke the tension again, soft but resolute. I wanted you to hear me, to understand that it wasn't just a fleeting mistake. I nodded, my hand brushing briefly against the edge of hers as I adjusted my coat, a fleeting but deliberate contact that conveyed acknowledgement, respect, and the fragile intimacy we both craved yet restrained. In that moment, standing under the rain, the emotional peak of our story unfolded, not in dramatic gestures or shouted confessions, but in the quiet recognition of connection, honesty, and unspoken longing. The night, the rain, and our proximity all conspired to make the truth undeniable. We cared, we yearned, and the choices we had made would never erase what existed between us. The morning light spilled softly through the curtains, painting her apartment in gentle hues of gold and amber. The rain from the previous night had stopped, leaving a crisp freshness in the air and a quiet sense of renewal. I found myself sitting across from her at the small kitchen table, the warmth of my coffee cup grounding me, the aroma mingling subtly with the faint scent of her perfume. For a moment, the world outside could have ceased entirely, and it would not have mattered. We existed only in the space we now shared. She looked at me, her eyes steady but softened, as if the weight of our long conversation had lifted just enough to reveal a vulnerability she had kept hidden. There was no pretense here, no need to perform confidence or grace. She simply was, and that presence carried more meaning than any words could express. I don't expect forgiveness right away, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, yet every syllable resonated with honesty. I studied her face, noting the subtle changes, the faint lines near her eyes from worry, the gentle curve of her lips that held both apprehension and hope. My heart softened, but my voice remained calm, deliberate, carrying the balance of acknowledgement and clarity. I don't know if everything can go back to the way it was. But I do know this, you and I, we can move forward. Carefully, honestly, with respect. There was a silence, heavy yet comfortable, as if both of us were savoring the presence of one another without needing to fill the space with empty words. She shifted slightly, her hand brushing the edge of the table, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her fingers. I leaned forward just enough that our knees almost touched beneath the table, and a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement passed between us. I made choices I regret, she admitted, her voice firmer now, shaped by the honesty of the past days. But I also feel something I can't ignore. Something worth holding on to. Her eyes searched mine, and in that gaze I recognized the mirror of my own conflicted feelings, the mixture of longing, caution, and a desire for connection that had persisted despite everything. I reached out slowly, letting my hand hover near hers before resting it lightly atop hers. The contact was gentle, deliberate, safe, yet intimate, a signal that trust and affection could exist without overstepping boundaries. She responded by turning her hand slightly, letting our fingers brush in a soft, careful clasp. In that single gesture, the years of hesitation, misunderstanding, and unspoken longing converged into a fragile, undeniable truth: connection survived choice, even when it had been tested. We sat there for a long moment, the morning light warming our faces, the room filled with quiet acknowledgement and tentative hope. There was no dramatic declaration, no explosive resolution, only the steady, human truth that we had confronted the past, acknowledged mistakes, and chosen to move forward with awareness and care. As we finally rose, the city outside beckoning with its usual rhythm, I realized that the story wasn't about perfection or certainty. It was about honesty, presence, and the courage to honor both emotion and consequence. We would carry the weight of choices and mistakes, yes, but we would also carry the warmth of understanding, connection, and the fragile promise of something real. And in that quiet, tender resolution, we both knew, whatever came next, it would be lived consciously, fully, and together, at least for now, in this moment of unspoken yet undeniable truth.